Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. The 30th of November is Scotland's National Day, St.Andrews Day. And so this Monday, Scots around the world, this year in a responsible, socially distanced fashion, will don the famous tartan national dress and celebrate Scotland and all things Scottish. Scotland shares our patron saint with a number of other countries, Russia, Greece and Barbados, for example. The ubiquitous disciple is also the patron saint of singers, spinsters, maidens, fishmongers, fishermen, gout and sore throats. Scotland's national flag, the saltire, depicts a diagonal cross on which the saint was crucified. It is a famous flag for a notable saint. So in a special show to mark the occasion, we look deep into history, to the origins of the flag, and also come bang up to date with the latest controversy provoked by Prime Minister Johnson, no less, on the last 20 years of the reconvening of Scotland's national parliament. Has it been a disaster, as claimed by the PM, or a considerable success, which seems to be the majority verdict of the Scottish people? We speak to Sir George Reid, the former presiding officer of the Parliament, and then to Dave Williamson and Billy Kay about flags, celebrations and all things Scottish. But first, to your tweets, messages and emails in response to our show last week. And first we hear from Scott, who says, the presidential role exists as a platform for good and for candidates with etiquette. Failure to produce both at the appropriate time excludes the candidate. And Amal Huck says, I think that's really a tremendous change in America. And it's true, it will be a change in American politics. Richia says, we would like to have our greatest transparent President Donald J. Trump to survive the strongest US trade and economic stability. John McAnally says, Trump's not as daft as you think. He said for years the Democrats would rig it, and you think he wouldn't have a contingency plan? Philip says, the Department for Elections, etc. has said it's been the most successful and fraud-free election in modern history. Trump is a fanatic and a failure. Finally, Sally says, oh my dear, America listened. Trump is not a politician and he destroyed your American political system and he destroyed the American election system. Don't forget. Of course, as ever, things are fast moving in the US of A, and President Trump has, of course, conceded the transition process. Now, Prime Minister Johnson may be self-isolating in Downing Street, but this has not dulled his talent for commanding the headlines. He provoked outrage last week by claiming in a call with North of England MPs that the Scottish Parliament has been a disaster and the worst mistake that Tony Blair ever made. So was this a rallying call to Scottish unionism or another Boris bonus for Scottish independence campaigners? This is how he defended his position at Prime Minister's questions.
I may say that I do think that his policies of wanting to break up the union are a disaster, and I wish he and his party would focus on the real priorities of the people of Scotland, on education, on health, on tackling crime and housing and the issues that matter to all our people. That's what a devolved government should do.
For an alternative viewpoint, Alex turns to former MP and MSP and presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament, Sir George Reid.
Sir George Reid, Boris Johnson, devolution's a disaster, the worst mistake that Tony Blair ever made. What do you reckon?
Well, he tried to connect it, of course, by saying it was really a jolly good thing, apart from when the people of Scotland voted in a party committed to independence. I think the damage is done. You can see that. For example, letter in the Times the other day saying the biggest disaster since the Second World War. Well, that's some claim when you take in the Suez intervention, poll tax, the Iran war and so on. But what really concerns me, Alex, is I've done a lot of work in conflict resolution as an international civil servant and later since my retirement, where we, with the full backing of the Foreign Office, have been pushing the Scots devolution model as a means to end conflict, set up local control of affairs and see where it goes to. And opponents will certainly say now, why are you doing that? Because the British Prime Minister has made it clear it's a disaster. I obviously don't think it's a disaster.
There's something of a contrast, isn't there, between the Prime Minister's somewhat sketchy knowledge, perhaps, of the goings-on in the Parliament, and Her Majesty the Queen, who always, I think, surprised observers, certainly myself, and I think perhaps even yourself, that when she addressed the Parliament, she seemed to have done a fair amount of homework, which was quite impressive.
Well, it depends where the homework's coming from. I don't think it's any great secret that texts go backwards and forwards between the palace and the presiding officer's office in Edinburgh on a confidential basis, and maybe I just had a hand on some of these speeches.
Now, well, perhaps you should offer to help the Prime Minister out, give him some advice. But what's the reaction in Scotland been to the Prime Minister's attack? I mean, he says, look, he was really attacking the SNP. He wasn't really attacking the concept of devolution. After all, he was a spectacularly successful mayor of London, and by his own rights. Isn't there a point there that he really was just making a political attack that's been a wee bit twisted out of perspective?
Well, I don't know if you saw the distinguished columnist who said the problem with Boris is he suffers from verbal incontinence. And he was speaking to a small group of Brexit-minded Tory members from the north. He shouldn't have said it. The feeling in Scotland is, I would think, fairly aye-right. And politically, it was very strange because there's detailed polling and analysis of the Scots public, and only about 7%, 8% want to see the Parliament done away with. So it's not terribly good politics to talk to such a minuscule group when Scots, on balance, like their Parliament. They like a sense of decision-making in Edinburgh.
Now, for the benefit of our international audience, this phrase, "I right," that the Scots were thinking, what exactly does that mean, Sir George Reid?
We're listening to you, but we're maybe thinking elsewhere.
Now, listen, I seem to remember that Sir Walter Scott said that Scots liked to have a parliament because they could fling chucky stains at their parliamentarians. Is there an essence in which a parliament might get criticised, but that doesn't mean it's not held in the affection of the people? It just means they like somebody close to criticise.
Well, the Walter Scott reference, of course, is to the riding of the Parliament, where members had to walk through the streets of Edinburgh, down the Royal Mile, and if people didn't like them, they pelted stones at them. And I had a very real hand in bringing that tradition back. But, you know, if you look at the solid record of achievement of the Scottish Parliament, it really is quite positive. And again, I give it a merit, like my colleagues. We've had free personal care. We've had no fees at universities. We've had care for people who are disabled or have learning difficulties. We've a remarkable record of land reform where the people of this country can start buying their land back. We've had a ban on smoking before anybody else. We have an excellent record of human rights. I could go on and on. These are solid, practical achievements. And the mood in Scotland, which, going back to both the opening ceremony and the opening of Holyrood, emphasised the egalitarian nature of Scots society, which goes right through the professional classes, unlike London, as well as the people at large. There's a feeling that something more Scandinavian, Scandinavian social democracy, is perhaps where Scotland finds itself comfortable. And I think over 20 years, there's been very solid progress towards that being a more Scandinavian social democratic Scotland.
But in a deeper level, the Prime Minister might have a point, because given if we accept that certainly Prime Minister Blair's motivation for having a reconvening of the Scots Parliament was to stop independence, was to stop the SNP, to kill the SNP stone dead, as one of his cabinet ministers put it. Isn't Boris Johnson right to be a bit miffed that that hasn't succeeded? It was really a disaster in the sense that it didn't fulfil Tony Blair's objectives for it.
Well, you remember what I said at the conference when George Robertson made his kill it stone dead remark. Only 3 words, ho, ho, ho. And I've always been of gradualist persuasion. I don't like great loups forward. I was always very clear, as was my great colleague Neil McCormack, the professor of law at the University of Edinburgh, who wrote the Constitution for a New Scotland. I was always clear we had to take it in steps. You couldn't have a great leap forward from nothing in Edinburgh to an independent state. And it isn't surprising. At the end of the day, it's the people of Scotland who decide. If they don't like the move towards independence, then they can vote otherwise. The real problem and the real challenge, of course, is that the country is split more or less 50-50. And one has to make sure, if one's talking about new countries, that there's general understanding, general support, a plethora of information before you go forward. I
was struck by the fact that Boris Johnson, when he was explaining his remarks, said, well, of course, I'm a big devolutionist. I was mayor of London for 2 terms. And I was struck by that nobody actually pointed out to him the very obvious point that London's a capital, a great capital, but Scotland's a country. And therefore, it seemed interesting the Prime Minister didn't appreciate the difference between being the mayor of a capital city, important though that undoubtedly is, and being the First Minister of a country. Isn't that speaks some volumes for the Prime Minister's attitude?
The London ethos, the centralism of London, the concentration of resources in London, and of course, in that respect, many of the gripes you hear from Scotland are perfectly reasonably articulated these days from the north of England and the Midlands of England. It's a British problem. But, you know, the problem is much bigger than that. I think the British state, as presently constituted, is largely broken. And after Brexit, there is no great appetite, I think, throughout the whole of the United Kingdom to engage in a bold buccaneering Britain, you know, as it says on the British passport, to let the bearer pass without let or hindrance, requests and requires. My European friends look at that and say, hey, who do you think you are? And Brexit, of course, where Scotland voted 2/3 almost to remain in the European Union, is frankly a major turning point, in my view, in the future of the British state.
And finally, Sir George Reid, I mean, you've sat in the chair of the Scots Parliament, you've been a Member of Parliament at Westminster, you've been an MSP in Holyrood. Where do we go from here? What's going to happen now, Boris Johnson or no?
Well, I think everything in Scotland depends on the outcome of the Scottish elections in May next year. If the polls are right, there will be a very large majority for independence. That may be the Scottish National Party having an absolute majority, or it may be the Scottish National Party backed by the Greens having a majority. And, you know, frankly, it's about democracy. If it is, if the Prime Minister in Westminster simply says no, then I suppose there is a first step, a reference to the courts in Scotland, then reference to the Supreme Court, and we'll see where we get to. But as I say, like most commentators these days, the path, at least at this point, is clearly en route to independence. And let me just make a final point here. I've never believed in federation. I don't think federations work if you've got England making up over 80% of the landmass and population of the United Kingdom. But I have believed in confederation, where Scotland is an equal partner in coming to common decisions. And I think, curiously, you could come to a situation where Scotland is independent only to quite freely, of its own will, agree on a whole series of common agreements on travel, on work, on culture, on overseas representation, but to do so from the position of only we decide. Something rather akin to the Nordic Union or the Benelux Union.
Sir George Reid, former presiding officer of the Scots Parliament, thank you for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show, and happy St. Andrews Day this coming Monday.
And to you too.
Join us after the break when we find out just how St. Andrew became the patron saint of a country he had never even visited. Join us then. Welcome back. The saltire is in much use these days, with the Scotland's men's football team enjoying a resurgence and independence campaigners itching to take to the streets again. But how exactly did it become the flag of Scotland? Alex speaks to David Williamson, chair of the Scottish Flag Trust, and author and broadcaster Billy Kay.
Now, turning to you first, Dave Williamson, this 9th century battle, the origins of the saltire as the national flag of Scotland, and indeed St.Andrew as Scotland's national saint. Tell us about that.
Well, it all relates to the battle in 832 at Athelstanford in East Lothian, where the story has it that the Scots and Picts, it was a joint army, had been in a punitive raid into Northumbria, and they were returning with their booty, and they were being chased by a bunch of Angles and Saxons under one called Athelstan. And they were caught, surrounded, just to the north of the present-day village of Athelstanford. And they feared the worst. They thought that all was lost. And the story has it that King Angus prayed for deliverance, and he was rewarded by a white cross, the cross of which, of course, St. Andrew had been martyred, appearing in the blue sky above the fighting. And he was inspired, his troops were inspired, they won the day, and Angus vowed that having secured the victory, that he would make St. Andrew the patron and the saltire the flag. And that's the story that we tell just today at Athelstanford.
But Dave Williamson, isn't this kind of mythology? I mean, is that what actually happened back in 832, or is that kind of been embroidered later on to justify the patron saint and the flag?
Well, of course, there's no written evidence, documentation from the 9th century, the Pictish period in Scotland. There is nothing. But what we do have in terms of evidence is all the early medieval writers from Bauer, Major, Leslie, through to Spottiswoode, about half a dozen of them, they all refer to the event. I think the evidence is very clear. Incidentally, there is an even earlier record that we found out in a Latin transcript, and it refers to the battle, and it refers to the participants, Angus and Athelstanford. I think there's a great deal of documentation to support it.
Billy Kay, how important was it to Scotland emerging from the Dark Ages into the early medieval period to claim this patron saint, and indeed to claim a national symbol in the flag?
Well, the Declaration of Arbroath is one of the first declarations of national sovereignty, and in it we refer to our mythic origin in Greater Scythia, where St. Andrew preached. And that's maybe one of the reasons why Russia and Scotland share the same patron saint of St. Andrew. And in that document, we very much state our national sovereignty. And that document eventually influenced other nations around the world. But the Russian connection is fascinating because as early as the 1690s, Peter the Great made the Russian naval flag the St. Andrew's cross, the reverse of our St. Andrew's cross. And a lot of people think it's just because they shared a patron saint. But the evidence is that the patron saint hadn't really been celebrated very much in Russian tradition until a lot of Scottish Jacobites arrived at the court of Peter the Great in the 1690s, 1700s. People like Admiral Gordon and Patrick Gordon of Ochluchries. And it looks as if the starting of the Russian order of St. Andrew, based on the Scottish Order of the Thistle, was the period where the St. Andrew's cross, the Russian naval flag, was begun. And it lasted through to the communist era, and then it was set down, and then it reappeared when communism was defeated. So it's still used as the Russian naval flag today. And I had the wonderful experience of being in Moscow a few years ago to make a program on this. And I visited and spoke at the Caledonian Club of Moscow. And I've got a great photograph of Vitaly Mironov and Dmitry Fedosov, who's a great Russian historian who's done loads on this subject, of him and I standing beside this great, huge flag, which is half the Russian naval flag and half the St. Andrew's cross. So Russia is fascinating from that point of view. Other places that have taken up the St. Andrew's cross include The American South, the battle flag of the Confederacy, is the St. Andrews Cross.
And was that knowingly, sorry Billy Kay, was that knowingly styled on the Scottish saltire? Was there a Scottish connection to the Confederacy adopting the saltire?
There was, but it was mainly, Mark Twain called the South Sir Walter Scotland, and it was a big influence of Walter Scott in the South that affected the plantocracy, the people who led the South. There was also a Scottish ethnic element too, but it was mainly this romantic element of Sir Walter Scott's novels that influenced the South. You get plantations called Bannockburn and Rossdhu and things like that. But fascinatingly, when the South succeeded, the first state to secede from the Union was South Carolina, and the document was signed in the St. Andrews Society of Charleston, South Carolina, which is the oldest St. Andrews Society in the world. It dates back to 1729. So there's a definite influence there. On a better story, a happy story that I ended my Scotland's Black History series with when I updated it recently, Jamaica, where in 1962, as they discussed a flag after independence, a minister called the Reverend William Magee was friends with Sir Alexander Bustamante, a very influential Jamaican at the time. And they discussed a tricolour, but the Reverend suggested that because of the Christian tradition in Jamaica, they should use the saltire. So he used the green, gold and black colours and developed it, designed it into the saltire flag, and that was adopted. And I interviewed the son of William Magee, John Magee, who lives in, I think it's Cooperangus from memory, and he remembers the celebrations of Jamaican independence in Kingston in 1962 and the pride he felt to see all these Jamaican saltires all over the place. And his wish is that you'll see Scotland celebrate its own independence in the next few years.
Dave Williamson, Billy Kay just told us a story about the expat Scots and the run from the Hanoverians, and the 18th century sort of took the St. Andrews flag to Russia, in a sense. Now, isn't that still the way things are, that St. Andrew's Day is often more celebrated around the world by expat Scots than sometimes it is at home? Or do you think that's changing?
No, very much so. The expats seem to have a love of Scotland that we are perhaps lacking here. What's fascinating is that until we had our parliament in 1998, there was a lot more activity in St. Andrews societies in Scotland, and it's almost as if once we established our parliament, the Scots became less desirous of having to demonstrate their Scottishness through St. Andrews Day events and St. Andrews Day balls and dinners and the like. Whereas overseas, the St. Andrews societies, these are the big events of the year. The New York's St. Andrews Society, for example, one of the oldest in America. I mean, that is a massive event that they hold to celebrate our National Day. And it's wonderful that they're doing that. I just wish more people in Scotland perhaps would get back into the same track.
So, Dave Williamson, tell me about this restoration and renewal project. What's the work that you're doing?
Well, we have at Athelstanford two main structures in the churchyard. The first is the memorial, the Saltire Memorial, which dates from 1965, which consists of a massive concrete plinth and a plaque within it showing the battle scene. And attached is a tall flagpole. Flag flies there permanently. And then to the rear of the church, we have a Flag Heritage Centre, 1583 date B-listed ducat. And that was made into an interpretive centre in which people can come from all over the world, and they do. We have a 4-star visitor attraction status. We reckon there's over 100,000 people have visited over the last 20 years, and people can hear the story of the flag in 7 languages. Now, both these structures are somewhat dated now. The ducat is, the Harling is coming off it. The memorial, 55 years old this year, is starting to crumble. We have issues as well with the access for mobility through the churchyard. The technology for the audiovisual show that we have is desperately needing an upgrade. So we launched an appeal, an international appeal, to try and raise 100,000.
So, Billy Kay, I mean, obviously the flag, the patron saint, was really important to King Angus back in the 9th century. But in the 21st century, is flags and patron saints something we should be worrying about now? Is it all about passé?
Well, I've got my own St Andrews cross I bought coming out of my final exams at Edinburgh University, and I took to Germany for the World Cup, 6-foot long, magnificent St Andrews cross. So I'm still flying the flag. I stood under a magnificent St Andrews cross when I addressed the St Andrews Society of the State of New York, their 264th banquet last year. I think the St Andrews cross is still a magnificent symbol, and it's a symbol of our future. A great quote by McDermott: "For we hae faith in Scotland's hidden poors, the present's theirs, but all the past and future's ours." I'm looking to the future and the cross of St Andrew flying above an independent Scotland.
And will you be dusting that World Cup flag down for the European Championships next year?
I certainly will. If I can get a ticket, me and the flag and the family will be there.
Dave Williamson, how about it? In the modern era, is there really so much interest in national symbols and flags and things?
There certainly is, Alec. Any country in the world you could ask the same question to and you would get the same answer. I'm always reminded of Denmark, which has its flag, the Dannebrog, which is incidentally also derived from a cross appearing in the sky above a battle and inspiring the troops to victory. If you go to Denmark, or you go to Norway, you go to any of these countries, you will see the flag flying throughout the land. And we in Scotland should be flying it, as we will be this weekend, just as vigorously.
Dave Williamson, good luck with your restoration fund. And Billy Kay, good luck with your football flag next year. Thank you for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What's in a name and what's in a flag? Obviously quite a bit, given the sustained attempt of Scots over 1,200 years to claim the flag and the saint as their own. Nowadays, St Andrew's Day is just as likely to be marked by a rainbow of cultures and religions, and by Scots abroad as much as at home. But the point is that, rather like St Patrick's Day for Ireland, it is celebrated, in contrast, of course, to St George's Day in England. This would seem a rather dangerous territory and timing into which angels might fear to tread, but not apparently the Prime Minister. It's very easy for a barb he now claims to have been aimed at the SNP to be taken as an attack on the status and dignity of the Parliament and the nation. The national flag of Scotland is the saltire. The national plant is the prickly thistle. And there is an old Scots saying which the Prime Minister may wish to reflect upon. You may sit on a rose, but you canna sit on a thistle. And so from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now. Stay safe and we'll see you all again next week.